Hello, and welcome to another edition of Coffee with Comrades, a podcast discussing current events, theory, and action through a radical lens. What's up, y'all? Welcome back to another edition of Coffee with Comrades. This week, I got to sit down with my new friends and comrades, Matt and Johnny from Woodbine, a collective experimental hub in Ridgewood, Queens. The three of us chat about disaster confederalism, base building, and community organizing in the midst of the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. This dialogue is jam-packed with insight and experience, and I can't wait to share it with you. But before we get there, a couple of quick announcements. As always, we want to take a moment to plug our affiliates, the Rev Left Radio Federation and the Channel Zero Network. Last week, I misspoke. I thought that the CZN Spotlight of the Month was Doomer versus Bloomer, but it's actually Primal Anarchy. So check out this jingle for their show.
You were born a hunter-gatherer. You were born a social animal, one that moves within the land and moves between bands in a world that was meant to be less measured, less exact. We were meant for lives with more meaning and less consequence. A life where connection and meaning are implicit, where animals have voices and trees have stories. A world where rivers flow unabated and water isn't a health hazard. A world without fences, a world without flags, a world without rulers and gods. It's our world, the world of primal anarchy.
We are here to say that either the world burns or the cities do. We're here to say that abusers convince you that you have no choice. We're here to say that marketers convince you that you have their options. We're here to say that you are wild, that you can be free. We're here to say that there's a match in one hand and bull cutters in the other. And we aren't here to say that the world is waiting. We are here to say that the world is fighting. We are here to say that their story only ends one way. And we're here to tell you that there are others.
Primal Anarchy Podcast is a collection of rants, tirades, condemnations, readings, musings, explorations, response, interviews, and iterations hosted by Primal Anarchist writers Kevin and Natasha Tucker.
Find us online at primalanarchy.org, all major podcast platforms, and the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network.
Coffee with Comrades is an independent DIY project. We don't pay to advertise this program, and most people hear about it through word of mouth. So, if you like what you hear, tell your friends. The other way people stumble across the show is through recommendations in their favorite podcasting app. So, regardless of what app you're using, see if you can leave a review for the program. 5-star reviews are more likely to show up in people's recommendations. So if you take 60 seconds to write a sentence and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or the Google Play Store, it would seriously mean the world. Lastly, this is a podcast made by a worker for workers. If you enjoyed this program, consider signing up to become a monthly supporter of Coffee with Comrades on Patreon. We got a bunch of awesome perks, including stickers, zines, behind-the-scenes notes, exclusive early access, and a Discord full of friendly, heartwarming folks. Check it out by going to www.patreon.com/coffeewithcomrades to find out more. All right, with that all said and done, let's get to the show. I am pleased to present episode 85 of Coffee with Comrades, Against the End of the World, featuring Woodbine.
Unemployed graduate, the teachers ain't having it. Cameras everywhere, but the kids is gang banging. There ain't a war on drugs, it's a war on the hood. The Democrats and Republicans, both up to no good. They both got in bed with the multinationales. They sending us to prison instead of sending us to college. The janitor's mop can't clean the situation when the dictator of our nation is called a corporation. Swear to God, my mama never supported Obama. I'm a Chicago riot starter like a Haymarket martyr. I'd rather focus on the streets, organizing the tribes. Go against the grain and know that I tried. I'm not into working backwards, I'm talking direct action. I'm talking fighting for freedom for the poor and working classes. I would work for reform. This is for my unborn. I'm putting on a ski mask and this weapon is drawn.
So today we want to continue to highlight the flourishing networks of mutual aid that have recently blossomed all across the so-called United States by focusing on the actions of one organization in particular, Woodbine. I'm joined today by my new friends and comrades, Matt and Johnny. Welcome on the program, y'all.
Hello. Hey, thanks for having us.
Yeah, of course. Before we dive into today's discussion, could y'all talk about what Woodbine is exactly and how y'all got started?
So Woodbine's a space in Ridgewood, Queens, which is a kind of peripheral neighborhood in New York City. And we started in early 2014. A group of friends relocated to the neighborhood. And a big part of that was coming out of Occupy Wall Street and Hurricane Sandy. People that had kind of collaborated together within those movements or contexts, but were spread throughout the city. You know, New York City, there's more than 8 million people in the city. There's more than 20 million people in the metropolitan area. So a relatively small group of friends or comrades, it's hard if they're spread throughout the whole city or the 5 boroughs to really have an impact. So after those experiences in Occupy and the hurricane, we realized if we were in a closer, physical context or location, we would have more of an impact. We'd be better able to collaborate and organize and relate to where we were. And it would be a different way of relating to the city itself by being in a neighborhood. So we started to reorganize ourselves in Ridgewood, and then we opened up Woodbine as kind of the headquarters or the hub for that project or that experiment. So that was early 2014. And, in that time, Sandy was maybe a year before, but it still really loomed in the background because there were still parts of the Rockaways or Coney Island or Staten Island that were still kind of devastated by the effects of the hurricane. Still a year later, hadn't really recovered. So that was still looming. And we were really thinking that we were organizing or preparing for, climate change and climate effects and impacts of the city. But, like we were talking about or emailing, there's different temporalities or rhythms of the disasters, that we face, So by organizing ourselves in Ridgewood, we really had a kind of day-to-day rhythm or kind of weekly rhythm or monthly rhythm of how we were organizing. And now, it's been around 6 years. So we've met, hundreds of people, thousands of people have circulated through the space. And, by doing all that work, by being focused or organized for so long in the neighborhood, it enabled us really now to organize for this pandemic.
Yeah, Matt is much better equipped to speak about this because I was living in Atlanta during the start of Woodbine. I was kind of a latecomer to it, but I was involved in Occupy Atlanta and basically met most Woodbine people through that. So, we had shared goals at least.
Yeah, for sure. Was there anything unique that, you brought from the South, coming into New York? I mean, Atlanta is definitely a, heavily populated area and is similar to New York in that regard.
Yeah. But
were there any unique lessons that you brought with you when you moved up?
I don't really know. I haven't thought about that question. I mean, I guess the people that I was around in Atlanta were maybe more insurrectionary oriented, and there was sort of a different energy.
Sure.
But I don't know. They're just very different cities that I think kind of require different responses. And, to be perfectly honest, the reasons that I moved to New York were sort of incidental to that and had to do with other things in my life.
Yeah, for sure. And I get that. And I think that there's something to be said, too, about, the way that we organize in different places and spaces and times are necessarily going to change. And that's something I want to dig into with y'all. But before we do get there, I know that you guys have kind of reached out and did a report for Commune Magazine, and I strongly encourage everybody who's listening to this to check out the article. We'll link to it in the show notes. But I was wondering if you could maybe talk about kind of what the weekly operations for Woodbine look like in the midst of COVID-19. What does an average week look like for y'all?
Well, so Woodbine has sort of seized all operations other than the food pantry at this point. I guess one of the main daily things would have been the co-working space that we had. There were also a lot of talks that we were having, a lot of organizing meetings that were going on within the space. But I think we all kind of collectively decided that in the face of COVID-19, it maybe wasn't the best idea to continue that. And now, basically, all we do is the pantry.
You want to talk about how the pantry works, or how is it the Hungry Monk or the food supply?
Yeah.
And shit like that?
So, I mean, it started, I was already involved with this organization called the Hungry Monk, which I guess we could talk about more eventually. But when this all started, everything just really kind of like exponentially, like the activity increased. Like we couldn't really keep up with everything. There were hundreds of people coming every day, whereas it used to be a line of maybe 200 people on a Saturday in a park. It basically kind of exploded to like 20 times the operation that it originally was. So, Matt was kind of noticing this and talking to me about how we should maybe have a satellite at Woodbine. And, we talked to the main kind of organizer at Hungry Monk a few days later. And, the next week started doing it every Wednesday and Friday, which is what we've kind of maintained thus far.
Yeah, so with Woodbine, like the food, so we decided to operate on Wednesday and Friday, which kind of relieved Hungry Monk of having to just literally do every day.
Yeah.
So Hungry Monk does Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, physical distribution, and then we do Wednesday and Friday. But the food comes to us on Tuesday and Thursday. So it's basically a 4-day operation.
Yeah.
Where the food arrives Tuesdays and Thursdays. We have to like sort it and prepackage it and prepare it, figure out what it is. So we do that on Tuesdays and Thursdays, where there's maybe 4 or 5 volunteers who work for maybe 4 or 5 hours doing that. And then Wednesday and Friday, the pantry opens at 10 a.m., but people really start to line up.
Yeah, it goes so fast.
Yeah, people really start lining up about an hour before. So around 9 o'clock, there's people lining up, and it starts stretching around the block.
Yeah.
And, some of the distribution, we have to start distributing it before we really plan to, because there's all these people out there, so we have to get there earlier and earlier.
Right.
And some of the food is gone by like 10:05,
Wow.
10:10.
That's nuts.
See how it works. I'll show up at 9, and everything is pretty much packaged except the things that are perishable. And I'll spend about 20 minutes making bags of that. And, the last time, for instance, I would say we had about 300 bags prepared. We started it at like 9:45 just because people were getting a little bit impatient. And then by like 10:10, we had given out maybe 400 bags of food and had to kind of like frantically ad hoc make a bunch of other ones of just whatever we had left.
Yeah, so we already had like 2 refrigerators at Woodbine because we operate a CSA normally. And we had to get 2 more refrigerators to kind of store all of the perishable stuff. So right now we have 4 refrigerators at the space that, are storing food at all times. And then the other food we're sort of leaving out overnight, the non-perishable stuff. So, but it's hundreds of bags. We have photos on our social media that people can see about what it all looks like, or how it's not a very, very big space, in New York City and Ridgewood.
It's like enough space to fit the actual food and have like a walkway for people to like put it in bags.
Yeah.
That's honest. It's impressive. I mean, I've seen similar things happening here in Tallahassee, where, we go out and normally like a Food Not Bombs food share will, have 10, 15, 20 people, and it's been easily double that, sometimes even more. And so it's definitely pretty clear to me that, the pandemic has hit people harder than ever. I can only imagine in a really densely populated space like Queens, it's going to be even more significant and noticeable. That's wild. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, and you already mentioned it briefly, Johnny, but I want to dig into it a little bit more. I understand that y'all are kind of cooperating and working in tandem with a church organization called Hungry Monk, which is based out of a nearby Lutheran church in the neighborhood. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about how that relationship got started in the first place.
Well, I guess I would maybe try to clarify that like they wouldn't think of themselves as a church organization exactly. Hungry Monk was something that started about 3 years ago at another church, and this time it was just a Presbyterian church, and they were not part of the Presbyterian church, but just using their space. And the person who started it, Mike Lopez, just sort of had this idea of what he would call secular monasticism. And that kind of model evolves into a shelter he created, where the idea was like people lived downstairs, but they still kind of like helped with the daily operations. And there was sort of like Not that it was like rigorously enforced or anything, but there was sort of like a monastic-esque schedule to their lives. But this was just something he kind of did on his own, and it wasn't through the church. The relationship with the church is weird because the church that we work out, I mean, there's different spaces that we work out of, but I think the primary distribution space is a Lutheran church. And that Lutheran church has simply like allowed us to do it. And what he's part of is actually what's called the Old Catholics, which I guess simply put would be a schismatic Catholic sect that is typically very progressive. But again, like the organization is not officially linked to either of these, and there's people of different faith backgrounds, people who are totally secular, who are involved in it on both an organizational level and just being a volunteer. So, you know, it is associated with the church, but it isn't, is the simplest way I can put it.
Sure.
I think like we were talking recently that when the pandemic first started, the first couple of weeks in the city, like we were making a resource guide for Ridgewood and the city about different services that were, you know, that could be accessed or functional. And most of the ones were churches. It was before the city or the state had really started to function. And there was the Hungry Monk operation out of a church. There was the Salvation Army nearby was functional. There was a kind of Latino kind of church, Agape church that was running a food pantry, whereas a lot of other religious pantries had shut down. I mean, a lot of church pantries shut down as well.
Yeah, definitely a lot of church pantries.
That's one of the kind of issues of the crisis, is that I think more than a third, if not more, maybe close to half of pantries have shut down in the city. So as the need and demand is growing, the hubs and supply line was shrinking. And one of the things organizationally that we've had to do is some of these pantries that shut down, they still had the supply lines of food. Mm-hmm. So we're like, if you're not going to function as a pantry, you know, at least give us your food.
Yeah.
Because they were still getting shipments or deliveries of food.
Right.
So having to sort of take that over. But one of the things I want to say about the religious kind of dynamic is some of the, you know, first people that were organizing were people that had kind of grown up religious or in faith-based contexts or backgrounds or something, so had this experience of service. You know, I think both of us and some of the people at Hungry Monk, you know, grew up, you know, in religious families or contexts or households. So part of that was that we did service as youth or as children or something that was part of our background. And then the other dynamic was even kind of anarchist in a way, you know, have this culture or tradition of service. Mm-hmm. You know, basically what mutual aid has, this sort of missionary evangelical quality to it, this kind of thing where you're acting for others or with or on behalf of others. Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting politically to think of the spectrum where there's a lot of people that don't have that background, that don't have that tradition or culture. And I think you see a lot of kind of socialists or Marxists sort of on the internet who are more, you know, used to kind of being part of a commentariat or doing critique or having an analysis or being on Twitter or social media or podcasts or something, but they don't have this experience or culture of service. Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting within this disaster seeing who is doing the service and how and in what kinds of spaces and what kinds of formations. You know, I think in New York City, you know, this is the largest city of the DSA. Like the DSA is the largest in anywhere else in the country. And I totally thought that the DSA would just take over mutual aid, you know, because like basically that's how they had functioned with other movements, you know, with Antifa or the climate movement or the housing movement.
It's like there's certainly people associated with the DSA who have through things like the Bushwick Mutual Aid, but it hasn't been anywhere close to the scale of.
It totally seemed like it would be like a hegemonic thing that like the DSA would just be like, we run mutual aid in New York City. And I totally anticipated that. And it's kind of surprising that it didn't happen.
It's not at all what happened.
It's not at all what happened. And throughout New York City, it's supposed to, like, I don't think we identify as anarchists, but it's like all of these sort of anarchists basically kind of reappeared after the hegemony of the DSA for the last year or two. Yeah. And that's basically who's running these mutual aid hubs or projects. They're kind of anarchists, and churches basically are kind of in various levels of alliance with the state or these charitable organizations.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting because, I mean, you talk about the commentary. There's been a lot of discourse regarding mutual aid online and in lefty circles recently, and by discourse I mean like a lot of shit posting and naysaying on the internet. And I think that from everyone to vacuous Twitter trolls to prominent progressive podcast personalities, there are people who are saying that mutual aid is this retreat from the work, and that's all an electoralism. These people who are really bummed out about the defeat of Bernie Sanders can't seem to see that there are multiple battlefields, there are multiple terrains of struggle, and that rather than throwing in the towel and having this fatalistic or nihilistic approach, like there are people out there doing the work, and I think it's really encouraging to see that and to lift that up and to elevate it so that people feel less isolated and alienated, especially in a time like this where we're so fucking isolated because of the nature of self-quarantine.
Right. And I agree with that. And, this isn't even something to do, not that much to do so much with the issue of electoralism. But as someone who is a vacuous Twitter troll, I still rec that, there is something about mutual aid where, if you want to call it that, the work that we're doing, where at first it does kind of feel like doing things for people. But, I think the reality of the kind of situation that we're in and the positions that we're put in is that in order to work with people, it sort of has to begin as a working for people. And that, mutual aid projects should sort of, recognize that dynamic and work with that and not expect for it to kind of, feel like this radical project at first, because it probably won't,
Yeah. No, for sure.
There's also just this aspect of organizing, because I think the last couple of years with the rise of kind of millennial socialists or democratic socialists, they're trying to revive this kind of culture of 1930s era organizing, this rhetoric or discourse of organizing. But in reality, a lot of that just plays out on the internet, plays out on Twitter and podcasts and social media. And mutual aid is just this clear site or sphere or terrain of organizing, because you're meeting hundreds or thousands of people in your neighborhood or area or region. And it's really a different question rather than tweeting at them. But can you have a conversation with them?
Yeah.
Can you talk about what are their needs? What are they thinking about? What do they want, or who are they? Because one of the aspects of mutual aid or this pantry is just this question of visibility, because when Hungry Monk started doing the pantry, I think it was March 10th, so it's just a few days after the state of emergency was declared. But people were lining up for the pantry not because they had COVID, just because they were broke and needed food.
Yeah, and they saw something.
They saw something. So just by opening up and offering this kind of this operation or service of a pantry, you're kind of shifting the terrain of visibility in your neighborhood or your city or wherever you are, because you're not reaching people through the media or social media. You're reaching people directly through material things like food. So, a big part of it now that it's early May, a big part of the growth in the demand is the fact that people lost their jobs and wages and now, need money, or need food. But at the beginning, it was just, it wasn't COVID that people were on the food lines. It was just because they were on the food lines because there was a food line to be on,
And now I would say is really the peak of all of this. When we first started, it was still, when we first started during the virus, it was still a drastic uptick from what we were used to doing. Because I don't know if we talked about this, but I used to be involved with Hungry Monk in the past, and the extent of what they did was they had, they went out to this park basically on Saturdays and gave food insecure people food, kind of groceries. And then after that, they would go to another park where there were a lot of homeless people who congregated and give them just sandwiches for the day. And that was just Saturday, and that was it. And there was, even on a busy day, probably no more than 300 people served. And then when the COVID thing started happening, the first days, it would just be a random Wednesday, and we would get even more people than that. And we would consistently every day get that, to the point where even in the early stages, we were feeding maybe 2,000 people a week. And I think now, you know, people have kind of like exhausted their savings and like really just like, I don't know, spent their Trump bucks or whatever, and are still finding themselves, you know, not able to live. We saw, for instance, our last distribution on Thursday, we gave out 1,400 bags, and that's addition to like multiple delivery routes.
In one day.
Yeah, and that's one day in one neighborhood in an organization that like people probably only heard about because AOC put like an Instagram story about it, you know?
Right.
I'm sure there's, you know, like 50 times the amount of people who actually need that and just aren't even aware of it.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, you know, hearing you guys talk a little bit about kind of meeting people where they're at. I can't remember if it was in the Commune Magazine article or if it was in, you know, some other press release that y'all did. But could you talk a little bit about kind of moving, not entirely off social media, but moving a lot off social media and like putting up flyers?
So at first we made this web resource where we tried to, because in the beginning days of the pandemic, there were all these Google Docs and all these kind of resources, but they were kind of really crazy because they would be 15, 20 pages with all these links and resources. So because of the nature of our organization, what we do, we were like, we should really just try to focus on Ridgewood and just find the things that are applicable or available in Ridgewood. So we made this web page on our website that just listed everything that was in Ridgewood. And we put that out on our social media, and there's a Facebook group like called the Ridgewood Community Group that we're like the administrators of, that, you know, has probably doubled in size, and it's more than 2,000 people just in our neighborhood. But it's really interesting because it's kind of really diverse. Like it's different. There's cops on it. There's kind of right-wing people on it. There's people, you know, that we don't agree with at all. But I think that's actually like a resource or a strength of it, that it's not this like very insular kind of bubble. It is a generalized kind of neighborhood group, and we kind of put it on that. But once we started the pantry, we wanted to flyer because we realized there was all these people around us that still had no idea that it was happening or functioning. And, you know, we made the flyer in Spanish and Polish because those are some of the other primary languages spoken in the immediate area, and we started distributing them. And that's really when the pantry kind of spiked. You know, we were just flyering all the buildings nearby and in car windshields, putting them, you know, on you know, telephone poles and things like that. And I think that's when the kind of attendance of the pantry really spiked. And then, of course, it's just word of mouth. Yeah. Because we were flyering and then just letting people know at Hungry Monk and the other pantries that there's this other location. And that's when things really took off. And it's just growing and growing. Like our last week, like last Wednesday and Friday were our biggest days. You know, they were bigger than
about 400 people.
Yeah. So it's like, so after doing the flyering was just for the pantry because, you know, we put in a call to cancel rent on the flyer, and we put in a tenants hotline because evictions were canceled in New York City during the extent of the pandemic. So we just put some basic information about that on the flyer, but otherwise it was just around the pantry. But we realized that, you know, there's more to talk about. You know, people need more than food, and there's more kind of struggles and conflicts and information that people need access to, aside from just food and the eviction moratorium. So we were like, we have to expand our, you know, print, you know, capacity. And that's why now we're working on the newsletter. We're just designing it now. It should be ready this week. We should have copies this week. And we're making, I think, 500 copies for the first issue, and maybe we'll try to do them bi-weekly. Just to see. I mean, we can print more. It's because, you know, like Johnny said, 400 people came this week, so we can get just on Friday.
And most of these are just totally unique people from the people who are coming to the church, which is only 5 blocks away. So it just makes you realize, like, the kind of density of, like, how many people need it. And you know, there could probably be one of these, like, every 2 blocks that would see unique people, just because there's so many.
Yeah, so maybe we could even make 1,000 copies and they would disappear, you know, within 2 days. And this reminds me of Occupy, you know, during the, you know, in New York City, there was all these people that were craving literature, content, or information. You know, we would make a zine or some kind of leaflet or whatever. and it would go in 5 minutes, whereas before when you're organizing these things, you have them stacked up in your basement or your living room where you can't get rid of them.
Right.
We print up 1,000 copies of the broadsheet. I doubt it'll last more than a week. So it's like, this is the thing. And the broadsheet, the first issue, we have interviews with Mike, the director of Hungry Monk. There's an interview with our friend Jillian, who works as an emergency room nurse at the local hospital. There's an interview with a doctor who's anonymous because the doctors aren't unionized, who works at a public hospital in the city. We have an interview with a housing organizer. And then there's an interview with a friend of ours in Bushwick Mutual Aid, which is just the neighborhood south of us. So there's 5 interviews. There's the resource guide for Ridgewood. We have the numbers for all the elected officials. So this is kind of one of the things we're trying to do now to kind of amplify the organizing we're doing beyond just food, because we realize people also need more than food. There's other needs that are happening right now, and that are coming as the crisis extends.
Mm-hmm.
There'll be different kind of political and economic kind of crises and issues and conflicts that people have to kind of get organized around. But really, the food is really the anchor or foundation of the whole thing. Us having a space and us being able to provide food is what, gives us this capacity to talk about these other things, to try to politicize it, to kind of have media, to talk to elected officials, to interface with other civic groups or associations. So this is, one of the ways we can start to think or talk about like dual power is how do we organize ourselves to have a kind of foundation that we can then do these other things.
Yeah. One of the things that I've always really admired about the longevity of certain community projects is that they have a base of operations, that there is a central hub where people can congregate and assemble and work together and debate and riff off of each other and brainstorm and collaborate. And I dare say, like, it's one of the real important components of building power is having a hub. And I think about the Black Panthers, I think about the Young Lords, places like Cooperation Jackson or Chiapas in Mexico, places where people come and assemble and meet in their neighborhoods and interface with one another and not just talk at people like on Twitter, but like really listen to and respond to the people who they interact with on a daily basis. And so I know y'all have a space and have had a space for quite some time now. And I'm curious, right? Like, what were what are maybe some tips you guys have on acquiring and maintaining a space, a collective hub where people can congregate and interface and grow and struggle together?
I mean, I think having a space or like all the things you're talking about, it really gets to how you understand or identify power and what you think power is or power means or how does power manifest or how does power function. And for us, that was about having, maintaining, having material infrastructure. So it was the physical space. It was all of us being in a dense, localized area. We felt like gave us power. We opened up a community garden. We started the farm share. We opened up a bookstore and a cafe. So having these physical local centers in a dense proximity, we felt like was an experience or an example of power. And, with the kind of rise in socialism, that had sort of shifted because it was way more virtual. Like there was how many Twitter followers you had or how many people listen to your podcast or subscribers to your magazine, or it was discursive, which ideas you could get around. But, even the DSA in New York City, they don't have a physical space. It's it's the largest chapter.
I mean, they would often ask to use our space for meetings.
Yeah, like they would meet there. They meet different spaces. But it's like, it's kind of remarkable. And to be honest, I don't know of anywhere in the country where the DSA has a space. I could be wrong. Maybe there's offices and things like that. But as far as I know,
spaces that are like heavily affiliated with the DSA that they can maybe use, like reliably, like once a week or something. But it's not like
it's not their space.
Yeah, and like they don't maintain that kind of autonomy or control, and it's one of the things that's pushed them on the internet. And so much of that kind of that orientation is something that exists online. But then when you have a disaster like this, and you're more localized, just necessarily, you realize that your networks or connections that are just online can't really do that much.
They can't do shit. like you can like yell into the void all you want, but if you're not actually able to meet your neighbors, then it's not gonna fucking matter.
Yeah, and we have friends throughout the city and throughout the country that don't live near their comrades. They can't walk around and meet someone, or they don't have a space they can go to. And, you're really seeing it right now, who can really act or do things or organize right now. And I think a lot of people are realizing that they're not in a position to do very much because of that. And this is something we maintained. And to be honest, the last year or two, it's difficult because, we can see that the popularity or energy has gone more towards them than it has to us. It was obvious that they were kind of rising, growing, becoming hegemonic. Everyone was listening to them. They were more popular. And now it's kind of shifted the terrain, both with us, but throughout the city, about who has the capacity to organize right now. And it's really shifted, and it's been kind of noticeable and interesting and remarkable to see how it functions. The other thing about a space organizationally, I think it's important, is that it gives you responsibilities. You have bills, you have a lease, you have to find the money. You have to kind of get along with other people, which isn't always easy. Whereas if you're just some kind of commentator on the internet, you don't have to collaborate with anyone. You don't have to work out contradictions or differences. You don't have any responsibilities of having to pay the gas bill, the electricity bill, how to maintain the lease, how to deal with the landlord. Mm-hmm. If there's a flood, who fixes the space, who cleans the space. Mm-hmm. And I think organizationally dealing with those things gives you a certain maturity and capacity where a lot of people just on social media, or a lot of these kind of socialist commentators, just don't have it. They don't have that capacity. They don't have that kind of competence or that sort of organizational capacity to deal with these things. And I think that's all of those reasons are part of the way that we're able to respond right now to the pandemic, where a lot of other, political groups, organizations, or tendencies aren't, because they haven't focused on these questions for so long.
And I imagine there are people listening to this right now who are like, damn, I would love to have a hub in my city, in my neighborhood, in my borough, but where do I get started? And so what would you say to those kinds of folks who are like, fuck yeah, like I'm hearing what you're saying, Matt and Johnny, you're preaching to the choir. Well, what do I do next? How do I acquire that space? And I know that, again, you guys may not have the answers to that, and it's going to look different for different people in different places. But with those caveats in place, is there any advice you would give to a listener who's like, fuck yeah, sign me up, I want to build a hub. What should I do first?
One of the things I would say is, like, we talked a little bit earlier about what, having to ask yourself what you think power is and what power means. The other question is having to ask yourself what politics is and what politics means, because I think for a lot of people, there's a kind of ideological purity that they associate with it, and they think they have this very particular line that, includes or doesn't include different things. But wherever you are in Tallahassee or Queens or Atlanta or wherever, you have to figure out what's possible with the other people who are around. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to kind of pool resources or money together and maintain a space, it might very well include people that you don't agree with about everything, that have different lines, different emphasis, different tendencies. But if you're trying to raise $1,000 or $2,000 a month to pay your bills or expenses for a space, you have to figure out, who could I possibly collaborate with to do this? And you have to really ask yourself, is it worth making quote unquote compromises politically to kind of partner with these people, these different organizations, these different entities? And I think that's an important question that a lot of people don't have to ask themselves, because if they're just some sort of ideological commentator, they never have to compromise anything or challenge themselves. Whereas if you're really going to build power, build these organizational or institutional capacities, you have to work with other people. Yeah. Lots of us at Woodbine, we don't all love each other. We don't all agree with each other about everything. Mm-hmm. But over the last 6 years, we've recognized the importance of maintaining the space together as a kind of shared collective resource for different people to try things and do things.
Yeah, there's definitely no hard ideological line. And I think the people who are there, it's more because they're friends and there's a similar disposition that they have, but it's not something that's really strictly marked by a tendency And it's just people who kind of like see what's necessary, and maybe they have a different vision for that, but there is enough trust that kind of like precedes the founding of it, where like they can build something successful.
And even the friendships had to be expanded because, you know, a lot of groups organize like we're great friends or we agree with each other. But I think having a space and having those material and financial responsibilities is really important. And I think it was important for us to confront, because whether or not you're friends or whether or not you agree with each other, you have to pay your bills every month. Aside from the pandemic, but it's like that materiality forces a different level of maturity. And maybe maturity is not the right word, but a level of seriousness, maybe I should say.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be serious about maintaining a kind of institution, for lack of a better word, for 6 years, and making sure that those bills are paid, you're going to be a kind of probably more competent organizer.
Yeah.
You know, whereas if it's just based on friendship or what people might think on any given month, you know, that changes or vacillates. People go through different phases, tendencies, interests. But by, you know, when you talk about stuff like the Zapatistas or Cooperation Jackson, it's also the longevity, the commitment to kind of to keep going. You know, it's not just like a fad that's cool or hip right now that you put in your avatar, or you put some emoji that signals what you think at this moment. You know, to maintain stuff for 5 years or 10 years or decades requires a different seriousness, basically. And I think this is going to have to go on. You know, I don't think with this pandemic, you know, it's been a month and a half, 2 months. But however long the medical crisis lasts, I think the economic crisis is going to be years.
Yeah.
And I think people are really going to have to basically be serious. You know, are they going to be serious organizers and commit to kind of maintain these projects long term? And I think that's what we're kind of seeing about who's able to respond now and who's preparing themselves to respond over the next months or the next year or so.
Yeah, well, speaking of being serious and being militant, one of the things that really struck me about your email, the thing that really caught my eye and was like, damn, I got to talk to these folks. It's something that I've considered a lot, because the tagline of it was from mutual aid to disaster confederalism. And I think I know what you're talking about here. I mean, context clues, that sort of thing. But I wanted to maybe pick your brain a little bit about, like, what does that philosophy mean to you, and why do we need to move from mutual aid to a more confederalist approach when thinking about and responding to the myriad of disasters that are constantly happening all around us?
I think the problem is that these mutual aid projects just like don't have the ability to kind of like scale up or expand and just be kind of become like self-satisfied in their own sort of like insular little thing where like it definitely feels like you're doing something and you are doing something, but there's like no ability to imagine beyond that. I mean, I remember as someone who has a lot of experience with Food Not Bombs, it was like we didn't even have a comprehension of what it would mean to feed more than like 30 people in a park. And the kind of like urgency to move beyond that model becomes like all the more pronounced when there's a pandemic. And that like kind of requires a certain thinking about like logistics even, and just like, I don't know, like you can't just think of it as this small little anarchist project anymore. It's something bigger than that, and something that has to make connections. And sometimes those connections are like a little bit unsavory even, but you have to think on a much bigger scale.
Yeah, I think also like with the mutual aid, it was clear that we had, you know, it was necessary and urgent and vital, but we also had to think beyond it, or kind of where does it go, or what's the political horizon of it beyond just, you know, giving people food on a daily or weekly basis, which of course we need to do, but how does that then turn into something else, or how does that then get leveraged into a different political imaginary or political process or project or something? And just quickly before I get to the confederalism, with mutual aid, at first, when we were launching the pantry, you know, in March or early April, you know, we would make these social media posts about it, and we would get all these likes and shares and all this attention, and people loved it. And we've noticed the last week or two that it's kind of declining. That I think there's like a mutual aid fatigue, you know, where it's like the novelty is wearing off of like.
But it's like an inverse relationship. At the same time that there's this mutual aid fatigue, there's like a spike in like how many people are in need and how many people are like reaching out to us for food.
Yeah, like there's the novelty of the mutual aid response that people like and appreciate, and it's cute, and people are taking photos and selfies and masks and gloves with food, and everyone likes it and wants to support it. But now that people are getting a bit tired of it and sick of it or exhausted of it, how do we face the fact that simultaneously the need is growing and demand, and that's also this question of visibility, like the visibility of the people on our food lines that are wrapping around the block with the visibility of who decides on social media or the media what is worth talking about or highlighting or sharing at any given moment. But in terms of the disaster confederalism idea, there was this idea of disaster communism, or the Rebecca Solnit kind of thesis that in disasters people come together and they have this egalitarian kind of utopian kind of response where they're all sharing things and coming together and supporting each other. But normally those disasters are localized, whether it's a hurricane or 9/11 or whatever it is that happens in one particular place or a small region, where now we're having this disaster that's national, if not global, where everything's it's not oh, I feel bad for this island that had a hurricane, or I feel bad for this area that had an earthquake, and we're all going to support them, and they're having this utopian thing, but everyone else is functional. Mm-hmm. Now the entire nation or globe are kind of dysfunctional, and all of these mutual aid hubs were popping up, and it was clear to us that those mutual aid hubs would need to start to think of themselves as kind of organizing bases, mm-hmm. beyond just the food or something, that they were kind of becoming these bases that could organize politically outside of the government or outside of kind of these models, and would have to network amongst each other, imagine a different kind of frame of power, frame political organizing, or frame of a political organization. So that was the confederalism. And, it's obviously a play on, Bilal Öcalan, the kind of Kurdish thinker, leader, has this idea of democratic confederalism.
Of course.
Or Murray Bookchin talks about confederalism. So it was a play on disaster communism, these localized experiences after a hurricane of this utopian kind of coming together after a disaster, with this confederal imaginary that kind of is breaking away from how, national or global organizations function. And really the hope or the horizon would be, how would these mutual aid hubs in different neighborhoods or cities, how could they start to think of themselves as organizing bases, basically? And that's sort of the imaginary to think about.
Yeah, and I love that you're painting that picture and pointing to Rebecca Solnit's fabulous thesis about how people come together. And I think that you're absolutely right that time and time again, that idea of hers has been confirmed, that there's this flash flood of outpouring of generosity and solidarity and mutual aid, but as you are experiencing currently, and as anyone who has lived through and organized after disasters will attest, it ebbs and it goes away. And to your point, right, Johnny, it's usually at the most important fucking time where it's most crucial to get help. And I've experienced this myself, organizing with Hurricane Michael and with Hurricane Irma. And, this is something that I've talked about with my friends and comrades in mutual aid disaster relief time and time and time again, is, how do we move from the emergency heart moment where you have this immense desire to put out the fire, to building the capacity and the resiliency to struggle towards making these types of programs not one-off events, not these reactionary kind of things, not reactionary in the political sense, but reactive is perhaps the better word, these reactive types of organizing, and build dual power. Because I think that's really what we're getting at here, right, is this conception of needing to have the capacity and the resiliency to struggle together so that these things don't just flicker away and fade and dissolve. And I'm sure it's no secret to the two of you that we are all constantly suffering under a wave of different intersecting oppressions, from white supremacy to patriarchy to heteronormativity, all of these intersectional ways that oppression expresses itself. And, I think that one of the ways that y'all have found that I think is so interesting is having that base of operations, having that hub. And I think that that's, again, not a model, it's not a formula, but I think it is one crucial facet of building that type of confederalist approach to disaster response that I think we need to see, that is capable of not just being a flashpoint, but has the capacity, the resiliency, the militancy, and to use your word, Matt, the seriousness to really engage with these things in the long term.
Well, to answer the first part of that question, I mean, I think trying to sustain this beyond this kind of like one-off moment has a lot to do with kind of like bringing new people in and just like increasing visibility. Because I think before this, I mean, as you know, we did a lot in the neighborhood, but there's still plenty of people, especially people who are, you know, have lived there forever. Maybe they even lived across from the block from us and just saw this like weird building that was painted black and had no idea what it is. And now they know what it is. And now they're maybe interested, maybe not exactly in the same way, but they're in some way or another interested in the questions that we're interested in. And they're noticing us. And we're asking them for their input, and some of them are even offering to volunteer. So there is this kind of relationship that's forming with the neighborhood. There is a sort of recognition and visibility that's growing, and I don't think any project can really last without that, and that's something that I think we were sorely lacking in the past.
Yeah, definitely. Like any movement or disaster, you have to find the people or partners that you can continue to work with after that, whether that's a church or a space or other good organizers or people that are good. You know, you see when you need to do things like run a food pantry or do a newsletter or have logistics kind of figure out where to get new supplies of food, you know, people pop up and you're like, oh, they're a really gifted or talented organizer. And, you know, it might not be because they're so politically, ideologically trained or sophisticated, but people are just gifted or kind of really rise to the occasion, rise to the moment. And, you know, developing those partnerships or alliances is how we were able to exist for 6 years up until this point, and how we'll be able to exist, you know, for years beyond or something. And I think that's true not just for us, but any of these mutual aid hubs throughout the country that are functioning. They've had to figure this stuff out, like where do they get food, where do they have a space to store it or distribute it, who's kind of reliable to do deliveries, you know, who's organized to maintain these spreadsheets and databases. You know, it's these processes of politicization are kind of building these relationships that will continue and will go on. And I think will need to go on or something. So it's like any movement, you're meeting new people or forming new partnerships or alliances. And I think this is just another example of that. And, you know, we're learning all kinds of things about the neighborhood that we never understood. We're meeting people that we never met. You know, we're finding ways to buy food that we never knew existed, you know, new supply lines of food, fundraising, you know, so it's all kinds of things that they're not just going to go away, but you have to have that, like you were saying, that foundation or that baseline to kind of store all those things or organize all that information or that network of people. There needs to be some foundation that can kind of harness that for something.
Well, the last thing I want to kind of touch on with y'all is building dual power where you're at. Because we've talked a lot about the nation, we've talked about the world, we've gone global, we've gone national, but I also am like truly interested in like what y'all think the future of Woodbine looks like, you know, because again, you know, we can't really offer formulas or step-by-step guides. It's going to be unique to each different location and each different neighborhood and community. So I'm curious, you know, as organizers in Ridgewood, in Queens, working with Woodbine, you know, what do you see as the most important things that y'all want to build up the capacity to either continue doing, or maybe projects that you have down on the horizon that you really want to see in the weeks, months, years ahead?
That's a really good question. I mean, that is the big question. Once it's hardest to answer. I mean, I think there is a consensus among the people who are most involved with the pantry that, one, you know, when things reopen, it's not like the crisis is going to be over, so that this pantry operation is going to continue, and that even if the crisis is, you know, and at least things return to normal, whatever that means, like this is something that we do want to continue, and like what that will grow into, and like how that will change our relationship in the neighborhood, I think is something unforeseen. But I think we're recognizing that it's important, and it's as important, if not more important, than some of the other things that we were doing, like the talks or the dinners or whatever. But beyond that, like I don't really know. I don't know what other things Woodbine should take on. It's a really hard question.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting about who's able to respond right now in this moment and where they're coming from organizationally or different tendencies is because maybe Johnny and myself or other people involved in the pantry also kind of had experience through different anarchist milieus or movements or something. There's a kind of spontaneity within that, or kind of adaptability or kind of resilience that allowed us to pivot how we thought of ourselves organizationally or how we thought of the space. So we're like, okay, we can't be what we were, but then how do we just transform it? And we've been able up until now to kind of figure out a way to do that. But, you know, it's still going to be an ongoing question because, you know, Woodbine was primarily an events and meeting space and organizing space where people would have to physically gather in person in a small space, you know, where dozens of people, 50 people would cram themselves into a space. It's not clear, like, if and when that will come back. So we're already, you know, not just now, but even in the weeks and months ahead, it doesn't necessarily seem like we'll be able to function like that anymore. But, you know, since we started, more than 100 people have written us wanting to get involved and volunteer. And we formed this new Slack group that has like all these new people on it, just from the neighborhood that we didn't necessarily know. So basically, it'll be up to us to be able to be adaptable, to kind of reimagine how we collaborate together, reimagine what Woodbine is organizationally and what the space is, you know, what the space does. You know, we weren't a food pantry, you know, 2 months ago, and now we are, you know, so we were able to kind of experiment and adapt quickly to kind of manage that. You know, like I said, we found a way to get 2 sewing machines to have stations to make masks. We found, you know, 4 refrigerators to kind of store perishable food, you know, so we can figure out ways to adapt and evolve. But, you know, that'll, you know, we'll need more people than Johnny and I or the people that were kind of organizing with us before. You know, we need the energy and attention of all these new people to kind of continue to see the space or the project as something to invest in, to kind of continue to adapt and find ways to keep it going. I mean, one of the things is...
Just to be clear, there is more than just me and you. Shout out to Andy. Andy, Tavish,
Marie,
Odie, some of the people who have really been supportive throughout this and consistent.
Just me, you know, on this interview or chat. But it's like one of the issues is like we paid our bills as a space through the events and co-working and programming. And now we're not, you know, we've been able to raise some funds to kind of maintain it. But, you know, that's one of the questions as a space is how long financially or will we go on rent strike and not pay our landlord or force some dynamic, or will we find funding to maintain the space as a disaster relief hub rather than a kind of cultural political space, you know, that we have meetings and, you know, we'll have to kind of answer those questions or something. But the only way we're able to do any of this is if there's people to kind of collaborate with. It can't just be 1 or 2 or 5 people. You know, we'll need dozens, if not 100 people that will be invested in kind of helping us adapt and experiment and answer these questions in the weeks and months ahead. Yeah. And, you know, so far it's worked. You know, we're at, you know, maybe 6 or 7 weeks or something since we've been running the pantry.
It's working, but, you know, barely.
Yeah.
It really is something that is just growing to the level where it's almost unsustainable. And, you know, I have faith that we will figure it out ultimately, but like, we definitely need more people.
For sure.
But that's the play. It's not just, I mean, the moment needs more people. I mean, people have to figure out how to rise to the occasion. It's not just our space, you know, like as the crisis extends, people have to self-organize. You know, they're not going to be able to sit home on Netflix and Zoom, you know, for months.
Yeah, that's the other thing about this is, you know, I think it's very important to take the virus seriously. I'm certainly no kind of truther about this. You should absolutely take all the precautions. But just this idea that, like, as an able-bodied person who's living with other young, healthy, able-bodied people, that, like, the most kind of, like, ethical thing that's demanded of you is just to stay at home and watch Netflix, I think is kind of ridiculous. Because, I mean, that whole lifestyle, you know, like, you're still ordering food and you're just kind of, like, offsetting that risk to someone else. And I think it's just like people kind of need to get over that to some extent. And it's like, yes, be careful, wear your PPE, wear your gloves, you know, like be mindful about who you're around and keep the distance. But there's like still things that you can do outside of your house, provided, you know, you're not like living with someone who's severely immunocompromised or old. And then you should just like do it.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Well, listen, I mean, spontaneity, I think, is one of the things that we need more of now, perhaps more than ever. For people who are in New York City, who are listening to this, who want to get involved, or for people who are just listening and, want to follow y'all online, could y'all, real quick before you leave, maybe like let people know where they can go to follow you on the internet, where they can congregate and volunteer if they're in the city, and how they can stay up to date with your work?
Sure. Well, for Hungry Monk specifically, which is something that, regardless of whatever Woodbine takes on, is going to need more help soon. On Instagram and Twitter, it's just at Hungry Monk NYC. And then for Woodbine, we have, what is it?
Yeah, the website is woodbine.nyc, and we have Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and people can DM us or email us at woodbine@riseup.net. And we have like a With Friends or a Patreon if people want to contribute some money to maintain the operations. And all of that's linked on the website. And yeah, we'd love to hear from people, not just about volunteering, but also, you know, we've been reaching out to other people around this disaster confederalism just to hear what other people are doing, other experiences, other stories or ideas, you know, throughout the country. So we're always happy to hear from more people. So
yeah, let's make it truly disaster confederalism, checking some of these other places.
Let's fucking do it.
And also, there is a fundraiser ongoing for Hungry Monk. I don't know if you'd want to put the link in your show notes or something,
Of
but
course.
if you go to any of our social media, you'll see it everywhere. So, yeah, there is that going on.
100%. Well, I'll link to all of that in the show notes so that folks can get engaged and get plugged in. Johnny, Matt, this has been a real pleasure. Seriously, thank you guys so much for sitting down with me, having this conversation, and more importantly, thank you for the awesome work you're doing. We need to link back up in the next year or two after some of this stuff starts to die down, and maybe we can maybe answer that last question again and see what kind of trouble y'all are making in your neck of the woods a year or two out from now.
We'd love to.
yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
And that about does it for this week's episode of Coffee with Comrades. This is an entirely DIY show run by workers for workers. If you like what you hear, you can follow us on Twitter at CoffeeWComrades and Instagram at CoffeeWithComrades. Check out our website, www.coffeewithcomrades.com, and sign up to support our work with a monthly contribution by going to www.patreon.com/CoffeeWithComrades. You can find Coffee with Comrades on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you go to get your anti-capitalist propaganda. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. While you're there, smashing that subscribe button, be sure to rate and review the show as well to help us increase our reach. If you have feedback, criticism, or you'd just like to get in touch with us, shoot us an email at coffeewithcomrades@gmail.com. Until next time, stay wild out there, comrades.
all in your mind.